So, Mr. David Kerr has a CV that is 33 pages long. I printed the first 8 pages, and that.
By the way, I've shrunk this thing down. It's ridiculous.
But I mean, it is incredible the amount of things you've done on behalf of children.
I have clones out there. You don't know this. That's ridiculous.
And but so all these multiple pages have quite a bit of value to them. They're all substantive. So that's really impressive. And my first impression of Professor Kirk was I was starting out this whole fostering media connections odyssey, or I was turning from this journalistic stuff and kind of thinking about, well, how would you put kids at the top of the agenda? And I was of course myopic around the group of kids that we are focusing on in this class, which are children coming out of the foster care system, but that's easily applicable across the board. And I came across this book, The Sandbox Investment, and that was 3-4 years ago. And I was handed this book by a woman that I respected, and she told me to read this, and I got very excited about those chapters that started talking about the viability of a kids first movement, a lot to do with the pre-K movement, and I was saying, well, this could be applicable to what we're trying to do, and and then I cold called Professor Kerr, which he's told me since you don't appreciate very much, but that was our first contact, and I was like giddy, like, hey, I read your book. You're a human. Can I talk to you some more? And that's how that began. So and then you were gracious enough to lend your name to this course's birth, and
You got me to write something down here, sir.
Yes, and
it's very effective advocate.
I got David to write something as well for a publication which you guys read.
We read it last week, yeah.
You guys read it last week. Which was well received by those in the child welfare world who care about education issues. So I'm very honored, clearly, to have you here, so thank you very much. And Eve, you have some history too, don't you?
Oh yeah, well, we go back almost family. My mom actually came to class last week.
Did she?
It was wonderful, and she enjoyed it a lot. But we were just here talking a little bit about the discussions we had last week, and we always are encouraging folks to ask as many questions as possible. I know you know about the way that this class and the ideas to form it, but we have a lot of social welfare students here, some policy students and journalism students. And we did a bunch of reading this week in order to try and give you some exciting questions. We have to compete with the whole room downstairs. So, so we're hoping to just, get some thoughts from you a little bit about, we read the book and understood the importance of what was happening at the moments of publication. And now here we are in 2012. What has changed and what are
the book being Kids First?
Yes.
Okay, that's it. What has changed? And by the way, I love questions, and I'm much happier being called David. Actually, can we go quickly around the table? Let's find out where people, who you are, and what school you're at. Yeah.
I'm Shannon. I was a research assistant for David last semester.
I couldn't leave you out of this story.
And I'm in the public policy school, and I graduate in May.
Hi, I'm Rishi. I'm an undergraduate student in political science and economics.
Catherine Ray, I'm an MSW student, and I graduate this semester.
Jason Wertz, first year MSW student.
Winter, second year MSW.
Stephanie Ludwig, graduating social worker.
Anna Jacoby, I'm the MSW first year, and then roommates with that one.
That one.
Tatiana Conley, first year student at the graduate school of journalism.
Orville Thomas, first year policy student.
Hope Richardson, second year policy student. One of the few representing GSPP in this class.
I'm Annabelle Campo. I'm an undergrad at Davis, but I couldn't for this
Oh, wow. Good. What's changed? In a way, I think I want to, and by the way, I really do love questions. When I wrote Sandbox Investment, little did I know, people said, how did you happen to capture that wave? And I had written a book before that called Shakespeare, Einstein, and the Bottom Line, The Marketing of Higher Education. It came out just at the moment people were paying attention to that, and it just, it got tons of focus, tons of attention. Sandbox Investment, was quite fortuitous. These are, how do these things happen? How do I pick these things? It's all kind of, it's in the ether. Kids First was much more deliberate. It came out of my work in the Obama transition team and my feeling that there was too much fragmentation and too little attention to structures of support for kids. And I think it is not of its time. And so I think as a book, it's made less of a difference than either of the other two in people's thinking in the field. And I think, for people, who want to write about this stuff and work in this area, there's the lesson is it's very, very hard to push back against what the dominant sort of flow of conversation is. The dominant flow of conversation around kids is No Child Left Behind, high stakes testing, reconstituting schools. That is really where, if you were to, I went back and I looked at the New York Times, or I don't know, a dozen stories on foster care since last October in the Times. There hasn't been a real policy piece in the New York Times since a series in 2007 which talked about the problems. I don't know how many of you read this stuff. Stop me if you have. The problems that New York City encountered when it turned the foster care program over to minority agencies that reflected the population that was there. So it was the troubled foster care system. Otherwise, you either had what I regard as the two classic kinds of stories. They're the awe stories and the oh my God stories. I mean, that's it, right?
Oh, and oh my God.
Oh, and oh my God. So I think, what is happening now is that sort of bits and pieces of the sort of ideas that I put out, get picked up by various places. And I see my job as trying to put people together, turning programs into systems, so you figure out, who it is that foster care kids are literally our kids, right? I mean, they are the kids, that we have taken responsibility for. And that itself is important in itself and ought to be a bridge to other groups that are, other constituent groups, other groups who are representing kids. And that's generally what I've done. So there's a thing called community schools, which you may have read about. Community schools is a pretty large umbrella kind of enterprise. How do you connect that with particular kinds of kids, special needs kids, new language learner kids, foster kids, whoever, kids for whom particular kinds of attention is important. How do you think about early education as connected to community schools, and why is it so important, to reach kids early in this, early in the game, and why for foster kids, for example, early education be a source of stability in a world that often is, better than I, is an unstable universe. But the sort of bottom line of that is it's very hard, and hard to make the pitch to journalists. We talked about that, if you'd like. That pushes against what it is that the herd is thinking. It's very hard to get journalists who are, by and large, pack animals to leave the pack and think for themselves. And that's why I looked at the Times. I thought if anybody's going to do a serious job of this, it'll be them. And they're all stories. They're not stories that tie to anything. And stories themselves do not move people to action. We know that from the social psychology literature. Stories connected to larger themes. Yes, if you haven't read sort of the work of Ian Garr, who's a social psychologist at Stanford, I'd recommend him to you. Stories by themselves are treated as one-offs, as I say, oy veys or yays. But they're really, in the paper of record, there is nothing else. for the last 5 years on this subject, and that says something. Either the people haven't been advocates with journalists, they haven't found the way to pitch the story that ties the event, the incident, to the larger theme. But clearly, advocates in the field have their work cut out for them in the media. From my 2-hour looking around to see what was out there.
Well, I mean, so in the mid '80s, you're an editor at the Bee.
Right.
So and I think that this.
I took off from here for a couple of years because I wanted to see whether I had a different life in which I was actually writing, opining on whatever. Would be a full-time job doing that would be a happier life. So it was editorial a day and a column a week on everything from Plato to NATO. It was a very. The policy students will know about it's now 32-hour exercise. Used to be 48-hour exercise. 32-hour exercise. We had 3-hour exercises basically, and I had them 5 times a week. And I couldn't tell you on Friday what I had written about on Monday unless I really sat down to think about it.
But I mean, I think having read a lot of your work, whether it was long form or shorter form, like what you did for us, I think that you kind of embody a lot of different things that I would like to see more of in the general mainstream conversation. But you definitely embody this notion of a journalist who could take stories of individuals and human beings and connect them to what you're talking about, this larger policy framework. So back in those mid '80s, was there more nuanced and effective linkages between stories and policy implications? Has that been degraded, or has that not been degraded, or is it just in our small corner of the world that people aren't caring about enough yet?
Well, I mean, without getting into a conversation that, again, I suspect you've had about the ever voracious media, it was possible in those days, and the Sacramento Bee is a really good example. Sacramento Bee took issues seriously and wrote sometimes too seriously to get the reporters to actually lighten up. It was a 62-part series on illnesses, one kind or another. And I said, people have to die of something, don't they? Have 62 parts. But there was the opportunity, the chance to write at length, and TV news shows had longer segments. There wasn't an internet to go running to. The market wasn't as fragmented as it was, so I think it was more possible to be a serious columnist who could sort of connect stories to opinions then than it is now. There were magazines that actually, now there are magazines beyond the New Yorker and the Atlantic and maybe Harper's, that would treat subjects seriously that weren't just expose subjects. I mean, the New York Times Magazine hadn't become a pallid version of a paper internet or something. I don't know what they're trying to be. So yeah, I mean, in short, yes, it was possible to have in a less crowded, less media crowded world. It was possible to have more serious conversations, and it was really possible to influence policy then, because politics, though hardly, it was just. There's never been a golden age. Just ask anybody who lived in a given era. Read what they had to say. From the founding fathers on, they will all tell you that their era sucks. Things were always better before. But looking back, it was a less partisan time. It was possible to work across the aisle. It was possible to make arguments rooted in reason. It was possible actually to write editorials that were directed at particular committees that were meeting at a particular time that would actually make a difference in the outcomes of what those hearings look like. It was possible to speak to a broader public. All of that is tougher these days. It just means you need a different set of dancing shoes to make it work.
I mean, so you're looking at this frayed media landscape, and you're saying maybe it's a little bit more difficult to make that policy impact that was more readily available through journalism and media coverage more generally in earlier times.
Let me just, here's the exception. The exception is video that goes viral. Right? I mean, we wouldn't be nobody would be paying any attention to a certain warlord in Kenya if you hadn't had a video out there. And as of when I last looked, which was a month ago, so I'm sure that its record was 10 million hits. And 10 million hits got Republicans in the House of Representatives passing a resolution deploring this guy. They got people dragging out the fact that Rush Limbaugh, God help us, had praised him. I mean, Lord knows, I couldn't bring myself to watch those videos. That wasn't too good. So I mean, if figuring out ways of making the new media work can have a whole lot more impact. It's going to be, we can talk about the relative thoughtfulness of it, and in terms of its potency, it can be huge.
Well,
a certain singer on a certain pop show in England who didn't win. Remember her? I'm blanking on her name. Susan Boyle, right? They're immediately somehow 10 million people. She goes from nothing to 10 million people in about a week. If you can figure out what's going on there in those odd cases, and what issue might actually capture the attention of folks. In a world in which lots of people paying superficial attention is a very powerful phenomenon, different from a relatively small elite paying a lot of attention, which is the old one.
I mean, I'll ask just one more question, and then we can let you. I mean, Eve, you can rip too, and everybody can rip into. And go. I mean,
rip into.
Oh wow! I don't know. I was trying to use
on the
some
third floor.
Superficially cool parlance, to get everybody's attention. So I just, I got really excited back in 2008 or 9 when I actually came across your book, Sandbox Investment, and then there you write. The Chet Edwards victory made a great political story, but it's too soon to know whether it represents a harbinger or a one-off. Harbinger or harbinger? I always say harbinger. Binger, yeah. And then in Kids First, you write, it remains to be seen whether the strategy of Texas 17 can be used as a template for future campaigns. So to me, that looks like over 4 or 5 years. You haven't had much movement.
None.
So
if you're downstairs, one floor, you would hear Ted Lemley talking about trying to get politicians to be defined as pro-kid or anti-kid. Ted Lemley, who runs Children.
Ted Lambert,
runs Children Now. There's mingling Amy Lemley.
Amy Lemley.
Yeah.
Who's also.
Yeah, I mean, she's a very powerful advocate.
I will forever hold out hope that can happen. I just think it needs a better spokesperson, and it needs 2 or 3 versions of Texas 17 where the Democrat beats the Republican in the most conservative district in the country because she is effectively labeled as anti-kid because she cuts $1 billion out of child health care. It doesn't take, politicians are really risk averse. It wouldn't take a lot to do that. But what's interesting is that's the mouse that hasn't roared.
Anna's got a question for you, and it's funny because in her latest op-ed that she wrote, we talked about naming names, right, of those assembly members who essentially are shooting down this bill. So she was naming names, so she's got it in her. So anyway, what's your question?
So it seems like, well, first of all, thanks. I hope it's a good thing, but the second thing, my question would be for you, aren't we kind of primed for that right now? Oakland and San Francisco have cut pre-K dollars, and have not funded it, and have only approved it for 300 kids in San Francisco. And there's a lot more than 300 pre-K kids in San Francisco that need pre-K. So, I feel like we're primed for it right now, and how do we capitalize on the situation right now, given your research?
Well, it's interesting. You had Jerry Brown cut, what's called transitional kindergarten, which is pre-K, by relabeling, a useful thing to do. Cut it, and then lots of pressure has led him to back off that substantially to back off from that. That's an encouraging note. I have no idea why it is that all of a sudden a whole slew of senior folks in San Francisco want to talk to me about what they see as the new opportunities in pre-K. That meeting happens on the 30th of this month, and I'll know what the answer is. But, and that is the superintendent and the school board member and the person who runs the pre-K program and whatever, out of the blue. So something is going on there, and it would be useful to make that connection. I do think that, I say two things. The San Francisco Chronicle is very open. I mean, they want local stuff, definitely. And if you can find ways of writing tone is so hard. If you can find effective ways of shaming politicians, without sounding like this, a story will help. A story segueing into something else will help. A story that gets somebody's attention will help. It is a good moment to be paying attention to that stuff, both at the state level and at the local level. And that, just a larger point about that is, when it comes not to I'm just talking in sort of macro terms, when it comes to the micro opportunities, grab them and figure out what the angle is into those opportunities. I was asked downstairs about how you frame, and I was talking again about early education, how do you frame those issues? And when I was on the transition team, one of my areas that I was responsible for was early education. All of you know the standard arguments for early education. I mean, they're right? Great investment, great for the kids, great for the society. Yeah. All of a sudden there comes the stimulus. Nobody cares about that. So what do I wind up saying? We're talking about moving billions of dollars into early Head Start and childcare and Head Start. So the stakes are very high and the window is very small. So the argument goes, early education and good child care are important because with relatively modest amount of training, you can take women who are the backbone of poor communities, give them a decent paying job, give them responsibilities, have them doing better by the kids. That money is going to go straight back in the community. So you're going to prime the economic pump. The moms who can now have a place to send their kids can now go find jobs. That money is going to go right back into the economy, priming the pump. And, by the way, it's good for kids. Not an argument that I love to make, but an argument that absolutely had to be framed in that way. And indeed, if I never do anything else, we got $2 billion extra dollars for kids with that as a metric. And if I had said, it's for the kids, it's for the kids, it's for the kids, people would have said, nice boy, patted me.
Can I ask a follow-up question about that specifically? Sorry, if anyone else wants to jump in, but I work at an early Head Start center now, so one of my questions would be, if we were starting foster care youth, and with your idea of putting seed money in a pot for a kid, if it's a foster care youth, who gets that money? Because shouldn't it be for the kid? Like, your idea is that if you go to parenting classes, maybe it would be put into a college fund for a kid if you are able to ensure that the money goes to the betterment of the child in an ideal sense. But if it's a foster care child in an early Head Start center or a Head Start center, how do you incentivize the caregiver to take them there?
Well, I think incentivize is we're moving away from journalism, which is fine, into the land of policy, I think. And I love, given my druthers, I'd rather encourage people, nudge people who are doing the right thing than beat up on people who are in that, than beat up on them if they're not, because it turns out to be more effective. If people do something because they want to, and getting more money means they want to do something, they're much more likely to do it than if you say we're going to penalize you if you don't, because people are going to try to find ways around that. So that I wouldn't look to, in this context, I wouldn't be thinking about the college loan, that sort of pot of money for kids that I'm talking about. It's the big idea. I'd be talking about those efforts as exist in Mexico and Brazil and Argentina, in which you pay caregivers or parents to make sure the kid is vaccinated, in preschool, attending school. You pick the variables that you want, and it works for poor parents. And it's not as though foster parents are somehow rich folks who are ripping off the system. They're not at all. So empathizing with their situation and realizing you've got, it's going to be, particularly if they've got a succession of kids in and out of the house, just keeping track of who's vaccinated may turn out to be a hard thing to do, but giving them a reason to do so, giving them a reason to send their kids to preschool is an important thing to do. Then, of course, the flip side of this is there's got to be preschool out there for those kids to go to, because it's nothing worse than to give somebody an incentive for a service or a good that's not out there.
Just to bounce off really quickly, your idea, just in the context of what we're doing here, what David brings up is about Governor Brown's budget and how, under the weighted pupil formula, probably pre-K got put into this larger stream of essentially general funding, so they were trying to play around with the money so they could streamline it, quote unquote. But they did the same thing, and that was early in this class with foster youth services. And the thing, I was talking to Terry Cook at the Stewart Foundation about this also, and the thing is they just are putting these things out here. We're going to put this into this formula, and if you really talk up and back to them, they react right away, and they pull back right away. I mean, you've got a few stories here and there, and they put foster youth services back out of the weighted pupil formula. So I think you've got these examples, and I think it's right. This, I don't want to lose that, because I think that finding those moments where you have a chance to score a little victory and celebrating those victories is important to kind of building that narrative of you can do it.
If somebody could organize 1,000 foster families with their kids to show up in Sacramento, amazing photo op, go to see their legislators. I mean, those guys hated the fact that college students from Berkeley were showing up and saying, our bills are too high. And normally they're very happy to pigeonhole Berkeley, as you know this. Okay. But when you get UC students there on the scene and you get all that coverage, that makes a difference. Imagine what would happen if you had under the banner of these are our children. 1,000 kids and 1,000 families, foster parents making an appearance on the scene, and that's not. I pick a number that's big but not crazy.
Yeah.
Within the grasp of, how many foster kids are there in Alameda County?
That's a good question. How many are there?
Several thousand.
I think that.
All right, so you just take Alameda County, all by itself, and you're going to have more than enough of the population. If you look at the Bay Area, it would be a doable thing. So I do think political system can look very impregnable, but you find those moments in those places, and again, this is about shaming and rewarding. You find somebody who's got kids. First Focus in Washington D.C., an organization that I really love, and that you ought to, if you don't know the website, you ought to sort of spend a fair amount of time reading. Great stuff, particularly federal kid stuff, but it's all on that. It's just great. And a very sensible, sane organization. Every year they have champions for children. And they go looking for Republicans. As well, at whatever level they can find a Republican who's done something, so that you really do make the point this is bipartisan, and you can be rewarded for doing this in a way you can come home and say, God, I was recognized as a champion for children. So figuring out the punish your enemies and reward your friends strategy, whether you're a journalist or a political activist, is a really useful thing about doing. I don't know if sort of off the theme that has come up this term, but if you haven't read And the Band Played On, which was Randy Schultz's classic account of AIDS epidemic, you should, because I think in a sense that's a model of the kind of activist journalism that you're talking about. Now, Schultz got a lot of the facts wrong, but he got the basic story right, and it was very much a Jacques book. It also was compelling reading, and you had stories about politicians who started reading this thing, and they just stayed up for hours reading it, because it was, Dateline, Kenya, Dateline, CBC, Dateline, just back and forth clips. It made a huge difference, and it was a combination, you read it, of the heroes and the villains. It was very much told as a heroes and villains story. And for AIDS in the 1980s, close enough to how that world was. So I just suggest that as a template for thinking about how somebody who sees himself or herself as a writer who wants to move the needle through writing can do so.
You know, I think you've picked up on this very well, is that that there is a sort of kind of reticence to be strong in one's convictions when they are a child advocate, in the sense that you can celebrate a Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Grassley, right? Out of one mouth, and then be silent as they hack away at Chip, right?
Right.
So what's generally, I mean, and that's not the same for every advocate group, right? Or every lobbyist group or constituency. So what is it about the whole child sphere that has this tendency for the, as you I think put it, kumbaya moments, or what is that tendency?
Well, I think that the most worrying aspect of these lobbyists is that they're not good at their job. I have urged organizations to go hire the tobacco company lobbyist, spend a weekend, teach them how to lobby. If you can lobby for cigarettes, or any other, get the insurance company lobbyist to show up. Teach folks how to do it. Starts with how to dress. Right? What do you have to wear to be taken seriously? In Congress, answer, you need to spend money to buy, the whole regalia. Don't like it, find another business. And too many folks in that field don't know how to, state level, federal level, and I'm thinking about California because I don't know the kids lobby as well in California, but in a number of states, they don't understand how the game is played. In Washington, I hadn't figured out that the Appropriations Committee was where everything happened. And the other frustration that I have with lobbyists for kids is that they see the world as a zero-sum game in which they have to do battle with one another to get where they want to go. And they never read Ben Franklin, right? All hang together, we're going to all hang separately. And so, they're also, and this is something that I won't name names, so I guess you could repeat it outside this room. Many of them are not nice people. They do not have winning personalities. They're never grateful when something good happens. When something good happens, they say, but that was only half a loaf, what's next? That's the classic sort of take in this. So if you're just going to be beaten up, you're never going to be rewarded, the staffers are not going to want to pay a whole lot of attention to you. And in the last chapter of Kids First, I was really being very gentle compared to sort of what my views were about what these guys are. But the fact that kids groups couldn't get together on the text of a letter to oppose the evisceration of the child health insurance legislation, CHIP. They couldn't agree, on language, and so they didn't say anything about CHIP. That's just astonishing. So if I put on a different hat, which is my sort of organizing the advocates hat, and I'm sitting in a room with folks, I get them to say, or I say enough times so they begin to get it, that it's not for you, it's not for the advocates, it's not for the supervisors, it's not for the professionals, it's not for the teachers, it's not for the social workers, it's for the kids. And if I'm lucky, I actually get these guys to sort of do a little for the kids chant. So leaving their egos at the door and realizing that the fight between childcare and early education is the most ludicrous. Just imagine the idea that little kids are little learning machines for a half a day, and then comes 12:01 and they go to the childcare, and all of a sudden they're now just supposed to be lounge lizards. No. They're just, they're more or less intense versions of the same idea. Kids are learning, and you want to give them opportunities to learn. These guys just do ferocious battle with each other. And the result is they both get less than they imagined they would, because I would argue at the local level, if you come in united, if the child advocates are able to unite at the local level or the state level, at the foundation level, raising money for grants, they do a ton better than if each of them comes in with its own pitch. My little group, not that little group, my little group. And I've been in rooms where there've been, foundation officers from the major foundations, and I said, so, am I right that if you had 5 groups coming in each with $50,000 request, and the 5 groups came in together and they wanted 500,000, you'd be much more inclined to listen to the latter pitch than the former pitches? Yeah, absolute unanimity of agreement on that score. There is not the zero-sum game is a very bad assumption to engage in, even in tight budget times. The notion that you think in terms of this tiny little category that you're focused on. But you can't think in terms of, gee, maybe we should be spending a lot of our energy not on little kids for the moment, but on death penalty stuff. On the save money by abolishing the death penalty, which is the argument I fear that's going to carry, that's another one. That's what's going to carry the case. It's not going to be the moral argument about death. It's going to be the fact that we spend, $1 million for everybody who's there. But again, kids advocates tend to be pretty myopic. They think maybe about other kids groups if we're lucky, but they don't think about where are the points of commonality with seniors. Mm-hmm. Go look for those points of commonality, because those that you really do not want to screw around with. Seniors, as that Buffalo congressman who supported the Ryan Medicare proposal, found out when all of a sudden he was an ex-congressman in a by-election. They know what they want. They're united in getting it. They got a lot of check writing, number counting, non-foot soldiers. They got a fair number of foot soldiers, and they do very well. So that's another place to learn in terms of strategizing in this area. Yeah.
So I mean, it sounds like, at least from your experience, that the advocates have done a very poor job in moving the dial. And I wonder, what about the public in general and getting public support? I always have felt that the argument for investing in children just seems so intuitive and compelling to me, and I don't understand why it doesn't seem to resonate with the public in general, and why there isn't more pressure coming from the public. So I'm wondering, why does there seem to be a lack of sense of urgency almost around issues of investing in children? Is it because, I tend to think it's because as a country we're myopic, and promising something to pay off in 10 years is just not a compelling way to argue for something? I don't know, but what role does the public have to play, and as journalists, what do you think we should be doing in kind of lighting a fire under the public to light a fire under their representatives? Yeah,
the public, the problem with the public is that it's this large, diffuse entity, and it's one of those iron laws of politics that a small, concentrated, intense minority beats a diffuse majority anytime. So what the public can do is what they did in the case of the warlord. They can watch, they can tweet, they can, that's what the public can do. And that matters, if you can figure out a way to make that happen. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important to find those, the sort of public one step down are my 1,000 foster care, parents. That's the public, as far as sort of seeing folks who are there. There's no kids organization like AARP, so nobody can mobilize the jam every telephone line of every congressman with angry calls about that bill that's on the floor, which they can do. The computer system is brought down by the number of emails sent out. Here's the form from the AARP. Send this email. It doesn't exist yet. And I share your frustration in an interesting way. If you ask, surveys that are done, and again, First Focus has done a great job. Among other things, they hired Frank Lutz to do some of their polling. Frank Lutz is a Republican pollster. thought this would be a good thing to do, just to, and not somebody who starts out sympathetic with this issue. Kids issues rank really high. And when you ask people, what would you give money to, what would you take money from, people are very clear about what they take money from. They take money from the defense, interestingly. Well, they give money to kids are number 1 or number 2 on that agenda. So there is this inchoate public, but I think that for the, and it takes some kind of an organization, some kind of a structure to mobilize it. So I would be thinking there's a, out in the field they talk about grassroots and grass tops. You sort of start with the grass tops and then the sort of the grass middles, like 1,000 folks who were there. Every year in Illinois, the kids organizations get 10,000, get 10,000, 15,000 parents and kids to be bused to Springfield to this event. And it's another story that I've written about where, a parent from the south side of Chicago buttonholes her lawmaker and she says, what can we do? What can how can we get more money for early education? And this lawmaker says, I wish I could help you, ma'am, but I don't have the power to do that. And she fires right back. So, okay, how do I elect somebody who does have the power to do that? That's, it takes a while to inculcate that attitude. It's a lot easier at the school level. You have this California law that, the parent trigger law. I don't know if you've talked about this. You get 50 plus 1% of the parents in a school to say we want change. Law on the books in California says, okay, these guys got to listen to you. That may mean a new principal, it may mean a different structure, maybe in a charter school, but you're now at the table. A lot easier at the school level than it is at the community level. A lot easier at the community level than at the state level. There are those moments when the state is vulnerable to prodding. We've talked about a couple here.
I'm also curious, sorry if anyone else left their hands there, is there an opportunity for constituencies you wouldn't necessarily put together? So Daniel and I were talking about on the way up here that the only thing it seems that people care less about in regards to youth, other than foster care, would be youth who are incarcerated. And if you have this group of interested people who are advocates and activists in that realm, and then you have this group here from the foster care youth kind of contingent, do you think is there kind of strategic sense in bringing together different interest groups who care about youth to kind of broaden the issue and develop that more concentrated and penetrating group of people together?
I need to think about that combination. You pick, a group that people sort of want to push to one side.
Sure.
And there are others. Profoundly disabled kids. They're in that category. People really don't want to, to the extent they want to deal with English language learners, they believe they should all be sent back across borders. Okay. So, there are others in this category of unpopular groups. I think ideally you look kids groups. I would just assume think about kids and imagine policies that will benefit foster kids or incarcerated kids, but that don't flag them as the immediate source of attention, because this is where early ed is in theory easy because those are innocent children at that point. But I would be looking for unlikely allies. So we know, for example, that there are programs that will substantially reduce recidivism among teen offenders. The best predictor, I'm now parroting something that I learned about 8 hours ago in my master's seminar. The best predictor of repeat offenders, who is going to be a repeat offender, is someone who has himself been victimized. Someone who's been a victim of a violent crime is really likely to retaliate. And there are interventions that demonstrably radically reduce the rate of recidivism and will save folks money.
Yeah.
That's a way of strategizing. And then, you couple that with the story of the kid who went from being, shot in the stomach, there he is, he's sort of persuaded not to do what everybody in the neighborhood is saying that he should do and retaliate, and who winds up, because there's this program that helps these kids at the hospital bedside, talking to those kids. And
Is it the wraparound at SF?
This is Youth Alive. This particular program is called Youth Alive, but I'm sure others. This kid then becomes eventually a counselor in Youth Alive. So that's a nice story. Couple that story with data, and you've got a case to be made. If you can that's a much more powerful case. I was thinking about that group.
Yeah.
If I could persuade the group called Fight Crime, Invest in Kids to pay attention. Fight Crime, Invest in Kids has made early education after school its focus. Why is Fight Crime, Invest in Kids interesting? Because it's comprised of district attorneys and police chiefs. If you could get district attorneys and police chiefs to say, this is really a good investment. We do not want to lock up 15-year-olds. That is I really believe that. That's not their idea of what they should be about doing. Early education, the data on life-changing after school, pretty good evidence that if it's really well done, community schools will reduce crime. So here's another place that you would want to piggyback. You think about arguments that you can make that will appeal to folks. Now, I get I'm with you. I don't get it, but I've got to be, if I can't somehow get in the heads of these folks, the opposition folks, then I don't know sort of what to do. And you get, one set of issues, which is this is parents' responsibility. The government has no role in the story, and that's particularly the case in early ed stuff. But you get, I've got to believe, when I was sort of paying attention to the amount of money that billionaires are pouring into this campaign, freed from all constraints by Citizens United, there have got to be some of those folks for whom some kind of a kid's argument would work. I mean, liberal billionaires, are creating their own pet charter schools. It's kind of like the fad of it. If you don't have your own charter school, you're not really with it, So figure out a way to get people with a ton of money realizing whatever the message would be that would get to those folks. How did early education get so far in California? Rob Reiner. Rob Reiner watched a TV show, Brain Development. Rob Reiner had an amazing Rolodex. Got, Tipper Gore involved in the story. Got national news coverage. Got 5 mornings on Good Morning America. Cover stories in Newsweek and Time. They were off and running. That's something that he could do. And he could also get moneyed people to contribute to that cause. I think that does require to get in the heads of these folks, because I don't know how many of you know about the famous exchange, maybe apocryphal exchange between Ernest Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald. And Fitzgerald says, the rich are really different from us, Ernest. And Hemingway says, yes, they have more money. I think Fitzgerald is right. I think the rich really are different from us, and you have to get into their heads to understand what it is that's going to motivate them. And they're not some uniform block. But that requires a kind of networking that folks who care about kids are several stages removed from being able to do. But everybody around this table is no more than 3 degrees of separation from a very, very rich person. I know that because you're here. It's just, and so that is just thinking very differently from how it is that we usually think of, because I think, come on, it's our future. We're stewards for the next generation. We're screwing them over. We're gonna, and besides, who's gonna pay? Who's gonna write our Social Security checks? Who's gonna empty the bedpans and wheel the wheelchairs around? But those arguments don't work. You got to find other ways of getting to those.
So I guess you've alluded to this a little bit, but why then do you think historically libraries for children haven't been that good, and why hasn't this change or this mobilization come to pass already? And I guess a sort of caveat to that is that I know I'm going to work in youth policy for like the rest of my life, And but everybody asks me if I'm gonna go be a lobbyist, and that to me like makes me cringe, just because it seems so. It's like that dog eat dog world that's the world that I don't really want to be engaged in, and yet I think of myself as like one of the most gung ho advocates for kids. So, do you think that there's anything? Do you think that plays a part in this at all? Do you think that potentially people who are interested, really, who have the interest of children as their like top priority, may be less?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, when I'm giving talks to, let's say, the Head Start conference, all these folks are there, and I'm saying, you guys are doing God's work. You really are. It's amazing, amazing work. If you had 10% of your energy that you could husband to use for some form of advocacy, organizing, that would be amazing. That'd be, and I appreciate how hard it is to do. But someone who is doing Head Start, is in a Head Start center, this is just not the mind. This is, they're kid-oriented, often maternal in nature. They don't, and this is true of, as you work your way up the ladder in terms of kids, folks are less kid-oriented and more other thing-oriented. But still, the idea of lobbying or running for office. I mean, Amy Lemley is running for city council in Oakland. Matt, whose last name I don't know, the guy who is the UC, runs the UC Association here, is running for the school board in San Francisco. I told him he'd lose because he was sane. Sane people do not win in San Francisco. I'd love to put you in touch with Jason Sabo, who is my favorite kids lobbyist who really knows how to do it, and who's doing it in Texas, which has got to be the toughest place in the world.
How do you spell it?
S-A-B-O. I'm not sure how much you'll find from him online. I had him Skyped into the Kids First class this year. He was just amazing, both in terms of thinking strategically, but just hearing what it is that he's done. Just one example. It is arguably the most conservative state now in the country. And how did he expand? And their legislature meets every other year. How do they expand pre-K when everything else is being cut? Well, are you really going to deny quality start to the children of our loyal men and women who are serving in the military, who are off fighting and dying for our country? And then expect, so you start, that's, that horrible policy. I mean, just, right, what a ridiculous way to sort of slice and dice the world. But if that's what works,
Yes.
group by group we got lots of heroes. The police are heroes, the firemen are heroes, the teachers are heroes, and all of a sudden, you now have a large enough block so that everybody else is saying, what about us?
Yeah.
It's those guys, because now you really have reached a fair chunk of the society. It's not, you've got to have a particular kind of mind, be trained in a particular kind of way. The Pew Charitable Trusts supported a lot of efforts to get pre-K legislation on the books and pre-K funded, and they did it in good part because they train a new generation of state advocates, Jason being the best of them, but certainly not the only one that I know. They recognize what the problem is. And it's not as though folks aren't trainable. They go into this world the way many of us do. Kids, how can you not see it, you blithering idiot? Has anybody ever told you that, that's a really stupid idea? And you sit there and say, oh my gosh, that was really a stupid idea. You persuaded me. No. It never, ever happens. So, this is getting into the heads of folks. And that, by the way, is true if you're going to be writing as well.
Yeah.
There are times to and you really have to figure out, there are times to shame, there are times to be funny, there are times to use parody, there are times to tell stories. And you as writers will be comfortable with different forms of that genre. There isn't one way to go at this story. But thinking out of, all start with we think kids are, all of us, that's why we're here, think kids are the most important, policy concern of our society. Everything ought to be seen. Wars, what is their impact on kids? Environmental stuff, what's the impact on kids? Not just the daycare, childcare, school, foster care. All of it. Housing projects. What's the impact on kids? What are you going to... And if you start thinking that way, you don't just build housing, you build housing with a school and a bunch of community services and a clinic and all that kind of stuff there. But figuring out how you connect up with people. So one more example, this is current. A buddy of mine works at the Federal Reserve and works on community development issues. So the Fed is a very interesting organization, very broad sense of what it does. So he has been, done a lot of research on concentrated poverty, looking and offering up, conferences, recommendations. And, if the Fed hosts a conference and invites you, you come. So he's an old friend of his who said, you really ought to connect community development with health. It's not just about building, it's about health. So they then formed a duo, traveling across the country in their $1,000 suits. I do think that's important in this story. And I don't know how much of this is on the web, but some of it is. David Erickson, Erickson, alum of this school, and Douglas Jutte, Jutte, are the guys who are doing this. And I hear this and I say, hey, in every community there is one institution that you're going to have. That's a school. Why isn't education hooked into this stuff? So, in principle, David Erickson gets the idea, would like to do it. There's a community school conference here in May. He'll be there. There are 3,000 folks showing up. He'll get more turned on. And I'm hoping, that come the fall, we'll have health education, community development, and we'll get, the Fed is an ally of good stuff, more good stuff for kids. Good health stuff, good education stuff for kids. But that's, if we're sitting around this table and we didn't know that story, we wouldn't in a million years think about the Federal Reserve as a place that might actually come to our rescue. This is what lobbyists who are really good do. They think out the value chain. Who is it that might actually be benefited by what our group cares about, and then reaches out to those folks. Bring in, if the Business Roundtable shows up with the kids groups, you get a whole bunch of people paying attention. If a Nobel Prize winning economist shows up with the kids groups, you get a different bunch of people paying attention. If you got those police chiefs and DAs showing up, you get a lot of people paying attention. People respond to different stuff, and you've got to figure out what that stuff is and who you can make friends with in that world. It means getting out of your comfort zone. Right? There is not a Republican in this room. There's not a person in this room who's going to vote for George Romney. There's not a person in this room who knows more than, Mitt, right? What's his real name? Wilson? Something. There's not a person in this room, I'm surmising, who knows 5 people who will vote for Romney. So getting out of... Okay. There you go. Okay.
I'm actually the only Republican in this room.
There you go. So, you get into their head. If you figure out a way of getting into their heads, 48 to 52% of America is going to vote for Mitt Romney. You're going to get into their heads and figure out what it is that's going on and go back to it's about kids. They're not Republican kids, they're not Democratic kids, they're kids. Then I think, and that, whether, again, writing, advocacy, whatever it is that you're doing in that field, raising money from foundations, figuring out what's the big tent going to look like that's going to get those prisoners' kids, those kids in prison, and the foster kids and other folks, people to recognize that they're part of the story.
I don't remember not much you have a question. Oh, I thought you did. Okay, I have another question then. Do you mind it? Downstairs, Amy Lemley said something about basically that youth policy, and what's not said is essentially that it ends up being like low-income youth policy. And I feel like that framework is actually a battle. It ends up being a big blockade for youth policy advocates. How do you think you navigate that blockade?
But I don't know if you were there at the time. You stayed around the time that I was sort of responding before I took off.
I heard some of it.
Yeah, but I think that's a mistake. But it's classic. There's a new organization called, I don't know, the Next Generation Foundation, and a friend of mine who is a very good kids advocate, Anna O'Leary, is their sort of education person, and I look at their 5 items, poor kids, it's basically poor kids can't, or there's this disadvantage or whatever, or we're so far behind the world in education and we need to do this to catch up. I think that if you focus on poor kids, you get poor programs. We get a history of this, a long history of this. That line isn't mine, it belongs to Ed Ziegler, who is the founder of Head Start. And I can't think of an exception. I cannot think of an exception. I cannot think of a program for poor people that is not an underfunded program that is always battling for its survival. It's not Social Security. I mean, just compare Medicare and Medicaid. There's 2 pretty straightforward examples. And so that leads me to try to figure out ways of doing what in the trade is called targeted universalism. That means thinking of programs that give something to everybody and more to the people who need it most. And there are going to be families, as Amy was saying, who are so rich that they don't need anything in the public sector. But there are not a ton of them. And increasingly, as private school costs go out of sight and housing remains expensive in sort of even in expensive areas, you gotta be thinking about public schools. Mm-hmm. And if you've got a seriously disabled kid, you are gonna fall down on your knees and thank the Lord that there exists a public sector that is providing services for those kids. Mm-hmm. So it's the last, the 5th idea in the 5 big ideas, which is kid savings accounts, is my model for that. One model for that. Every kid gets something at birth. Poor kids get more, and poor parents get matches from the government if they or others put in money. The result of which is everybody gets something, and poor kids get more. I really, I have serious arguments with my buddies, some of my buddies in the Head Start world, about insisting that Head Start is only for very poor kids. The best Head Start programs I know don't cut back the number of very poor kids who are in them, but they're good enough to attract fee-paying middle-class and upper-middle-class families who are subsidizing those poor kids in that program. And in those programs, they're doing it because they're great programs, and they're doing it because for them, that early education is a bargain. They're not doing it because they're great social crusaders. Nobody is a social crusader when it comes to their kids. I mean, you are about your kids. Everybody's a conservative when it comes to their own child. We do not want to take risks. But we have a good program. That does 2 things. It improves the program because there are more resources coming into it. It also changes the constituency. Now you've got middle-class families who are going to argue for Head Start. Not just poor folks who are going to argue for Head Start. So I really, this is where Amy and I, if we had a conversation about this, would sort of, I'd push back on this story. I don't want the focus, I don't want people to be saying, this is about those kids. Because if this is about this issue, it's about those kids, not my kids, those kids, you're dead. I mean, we are dead. So figuring out this is, there's God, when I was a freshman in college, we had to read Passage to India. It's the book by the Air. It's a phrase in there, only connect. Which had to do with the way in which this naive British girl was relating to the India that she'd come along. Well, only connect is really the theme of this talk. Right? Only connect. Figure out ways of making common ground. Don't create distinctions unless you absolutely have to. Sometimes you do. You get somebody who's bad, really bad legislator, call them out for that. Mm-hmm. But, start out by looking for the places where you can find friends in unlikely places, and get inside their heads, think about what's going to appeal to them. Whether you're an activist, whether you're a policy analyst, whether you're a politician, whether you're a journalist, who has who isn't just the facts man kind of writer, but really wants to push a cause. Think about the ways that you can get into people's heads. And there is no recipe, right? There's no single prescription. If you were to look across all the stuff that I've been spouting here, lots and lots of different ideas. Some of them, one or two of them, I hope would appeal to everybody around the table, and I can't imagine anybody thinking, I want to do all of that stuff, because some of it just doesn't feel right to you. You can't do something that you can't feel comfortable in your skin. But you get your skin to expand for some period of time. You put on that costume, you go out there, and you fight God's fight with the folks who are going to respect you because you're doing that. Or you don't. You find some other role, you're doing the policy analysis that's the backup stuff for those guys, or you're the journalist writing what you're writing. It's all, every part of that, every one of those elements is a necessary part of the story. Lo and behold, we've got to 7:30.
I have just one comment related exactly what you're saying to, especially the population in this class. A lot of us are social workers by training, and I think there's a little bit of a tension of either I'm an advocate or I serve kids, or either I'm a journalist or I serve kids. And I'm just curious your thoughts on how do people be more than one thing effectively, and what is what is our responsibility to do so? Definitely talked about kind of our ethical responsibility as social workers. We see a lot of these cases, we see a lot of these issues, and they may affect underserved kids, but often they affect all of society, different strata. And
if you're in the abuse world, abuse and neglect world, you are not just dealing with poor families.
Right, exactly, or mental health,
right.
And even
drug use.
Or drug use, yeah. And so how do you use what you have, like your actual material, and create meaningful journalism, which often kind of, instead of being universal, targets just the worst cases. And so I'm just hearing what you're saying, I'm thinking, wow, well, we see a lot of these bad cases. Sometimes we see success stories. Kind of what's a strategy for us to, kind of use this idea of creating a more targeted, universal approach in journalism.
So I was hearing a couple of things. By the way, there ought to be a prize awarded by the Social Welfare School for the person who thinks of the label for your profession that is different from social work.
Yeah.
This is 19th century do-goodery, and people hear social work and they run. So there's got to be a rebranding of, and it's also what you guys do. Right? I'm hearing nods around here. Nobody's going to kill me for this one. Okay. I think there really are. Again, it's a different strokes for different folks. To be the sort of the social worker is ultimately the ethic is about doing right for the client, for the person that you're working with, right? That individual. The policy person is looking in the aggregate, and some of, in the aggregate, we're going to be better off, and some folks are going to be no better off, and maybe even worse off as a result of what it is that we're doing. Very different kind of mindset. If there are folks for whom writing is appealing, and I assume that includes people around this table, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And I think if it is, it becomes a joy, not a burden. It's just something that and it's a relief. Some people play the piano, some people cook, some people, play water polo, and some people write when they're, as their other thing they're about doing. And I think the same thing is true of advocacy. There are going to be some people who really would like the two sides of their lives to be in play. And typically in that case, you're really going to be serious about being an advocate. I know people who would go back and forth. So you do social work, and then you get, at some point or other, you get tired. It's a I don't have to tell you guys, it's a high stress world, and you're always running upstream. You're always, you said occasional successes, which, just sort of that sentence, right? Okay, I need a break from this. I need to go elsewhere. I need to use a different part of my brain. And then you say, oh my God, I'm losing touch with my roots, with who I am. And maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to do what doctors do so well. Many, like the guy who's running around, Doug Judy is at the public health school and doing research. He also spends a lot of weekends a month in pediatrics in Stanford Hospital. So that's another way that sort of people keep their finger, and they find ways of, whether it's volunteering or working part-time in social work while they're doing the policy stuff. So I think, you know, there are different career paths that you find, and you know, one of the joys of, still a joy out there despite the economy, is that there are different ways of getting, you know, to the places that you want to be.
I have to run. You guys can finish up.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.